effects of it is kind of like the wind, right? You can see what the wind does, but you can't see the disability. Now contrast that with the body. We're finished here today, everything goes well. You're walking back to your car, your office, you see someone walking down the street, right? Glasses on, dark tinted glasses, maybe a cane, a dog, has a little trouble getting over a curb. That, folks, is more of a visible disability, okay? That's sort of a simple example of comparing and contrasting these two types of disabilities, all right? Keep that kind of in mind while we're talking. What I found really interesting about this study and about my work is when I started my literature review. I found fairly quickly, and this is why you see what I've done today is added to the body of knowledge. I found really quickly that there isn't a lot of research on disabilities, higher education, and self-determination, which I thought was really, really odd, right? I looked even further into the record, and up until I stopped writing and started turning papers in for reads and comments and APAs, in those 2 years, I still have not found one thing, one study that talks about invisible disabilities, self-determination, and college to this day. I think that's really strange, kind of odd. And one of the reasons why is people like Barber in 2010 and Jameson in 2007 are talking about more and more people graduating from the K-12 environment and going to higher ed. Okay? But what they also talk about are these people who come have more and more disabilities, who they've been identified as having disabilities. Okay? These same authors, though, they don't use the term invisible disability, but they talk about what kind of disabilities are going on here. I mean, you have blindness, you have hearing issues, you have stuff like that, mobility challenges. But what they also are talking about, or what I talk about, is invisible disabilities, right? More and more people, according to the same research, more and more people, the majority of these people with disabilities have invisible disabilities. And like I just told you, there's no research on it. Okay? Let me give you some background about my study and why I think it's important to conduct this research. Okay? Over here, think K-12. Over here somewhere, think higher ed. Okay? When we talk about the provision of services and assistance to people with disabilities in this environment, we talk about laws, or at least I do. Okay? So, there are 3 laws over here that exist for the purpose of helping students with disabilities. There are 2 over there. Let me tell you what they are. There's the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, commonly called the IDEA. There's Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And there's the Americans with Disabilities Act, okay, the ADA. Watch. Okay. Over here, we have 2 laws. I took 2 from here and left 1. Why? I summarized just now, had her 2006 and her 2007 article. She said, and I'm sure all you know, there is no special education in higher education. Okay? There isn't. There's the ADA, and there's 504, and that's it. Okay? That's interesting. Let me tell you why. The IDEA is a special education law act. It's designed to educate. Okay? It's designed so that if a student has one of 14 prescribed disabilities and is found eligible for special education, including the requirement of needing special education to learn, she can receive various services, including modified curriculum, individualized instruction, and a whole host of other help. Okay? These 2 laws I talked about here are not education laws. They're used for lots of things, but primarily they stem from civil rights laws, not education. And what these do in the educational realm at both environments is provide access. Not education, they provide access. They provide access to one's world, the environment. They provide access to the education itself. But they use these things called reasonable accommodations to do that. Okay? And the thing about reasonable accommodations versus potential modifications that we see in the K-12 world can be very different. Okay? They're not the same. The idea here with these 2 laws is but for the fact that a student has a disability, he or she is an otherwise qualified individual. Okay? The effect of access through reasonable accommodations is to vitiate, to the extent possible, the impact that the disability has. in common parlance. You see that in the literature. Okay? Here's the problem. According to some of these researchers, a lot of these students who are now going to who are coming from K-12 going to higher ed, have had special education. Well, that's fine, right? The problem is, as Hadley's pointing out, is they become passive. A lot of them can become passive. They don't know how to advocate. They don't know what they want. They don't know what they need. They don't know how to manage their condition. Okay? So, what happens? They graduate from high school, they come to college bright, and they never graduate. They fail, they drop out, etc. I don't know, it's not the focus of my study. But I am studying a background, painting a picture of what these kids have to navigate to get up. They've been enabled to break that. Okay? Skinner in 2004 and Barber in 2012 talk about this dropout rate. Okay? They say a lot of these kids drop out. But without missing a beat, a couple paragraphs down in their respective articles, they point out that a lot of these kids, not a lot, but some or many, do succeed. They do graduate. They go on to live productive lives, have decent incomes, those sorts of things. And they speculate that the reason why is there's some intangible going on. Okay? I talked a moment ago about reasonable accommodations and all that, right? But there's some other intangible source, some other issue, something that's helping them succeed. Some of these researchers talk about things like, Hadley talks about being empowered. Skinner talks about umbrella constructs like community involvement, what sorts of help you got from your friends and your family, internal and external characteristics, those sorts of things. But what Kostenbader talked about, we're kind of using similar terms, but he said something else. He said these people are self-determined. Okay? They're self-determined. Well, what's self-determination? Self-determination can be lots of things. And the point of my study is not to engage in debate about, well, theorist 1 says this is self-determination, and theorist 2 says this is self-determination. No. For my study, I wanted to find one theory on self-determination that was well-researched, well-regarded, and I can design a test, a study on it. I did that. Okay? I don't know if any of you know Michael Waymeyer or have heard of his work. He wrote prolifically in the 90s, primarily about self-determination. Perhaps serendipity is involved here. Most of you know I just moved to Kansas City. He's at Kansas State right now. I intend to stay home. The point is, he came up with a theory of self-determination that many people have cited going forward with their subsequent research. Okay? And according to Waymeyer, there are 4 essential characteristics of self-determination. Okay? There's self-regulation, which is using your ability, your skill set in a certain environment to get things done for the way you want it done. There's self-realization, which of course is knowing your strengths. He says challenges, but I took that to mean weaknesses. Okay? There's autonomy, which is pretty much what it sounds like, and that's your ability to act under your own accord, and free from sorts of undue influence, those sorts of things. And then there's psychological empowerment. And for him, for Waymeyer, psychological empowerment was sort of a gestalt concept, in that you had all these different abilities, you had to be able to have the wherewithal to negotiate your situations, to use your abilities to get done what you need to do. For him, it was perceived control, he says. Perceived control. Okay? So for Waymeyer, there were 4 essential characteristics when added in total, qualify someone, assuming she's at a certain level with these different factors, as self-determined. Okay? He's quick to point out that one does not wake up in the morning as self-determined, right? It's a gradual taking on. That makes sense. So, as I said, Waymeyer wrote extensively on this. If you read my references, there must be 10 different Waymeyer articles in it. Lots of other people quoted from him to make their further studies and investigations in self-determination. So I thought this might be an idea for me. I want to look at different levels of self-determination among 2 different populations, right? I just told you that these invisible disabled people are coming to college more and more and more, and the body of literature has no research on it. Okay? So I want to look at self-determination because it makes sense to me. I have ADD. I know that I can get where I was academically without being self-determined. Why not investigate it? Obviously, this study is not about me, but it seems to make sense. So I looked at this but I have a problem. Waymeyer's work has nothing to do with the K-12 world. Excuse me, higher ed. It has everything to do with the K-12 world. He didn't write about higher education. He wrote about K-12. And specifically, he wrote about lower functioning individuals. Back in the day, it was called mentally retarded. PC school psychologists now call those intellectual disabilities. It's one and the same. Okay? He wrote about that. And what he did was, using these four central characteristics, these essential characteristics, he and Kelchner in 1995 came up with what is called the ARC self-determination scale. Okay? And this scale purported to measure quantitatively these four essential characteristics. Okay? He did lots of tests, he did lots of norming. It was valid. It's still actually used today. You can leave here and go Google it. It's great. It's online. And the idea for Waymeyer was to take these special individuals and over the course of time administer this instrument repeatedly so that anyone, the parent, the caregiver, what have you, could see how self-determination is developing, or perhaps not developing. I thought that was great, because it talks about theory, it talks about the four essential characteristics, it can show how someone can grow. Okay, as I said, the problem was, it had nothing to do with higher ed, right? I'm looking at higher ed. So, I kept looking into research. In 2007, Jameson came along, and at the time she was a PhD student. She wanted to look at self-determination in higher ed. She approached Waymeyer and said, hey, could I modify a couple things on your test, on your ARC, and apply it to the more general population? He said, sure. She ended up modifying the 72 items he had, 5 of them. And they were very subtle revisions. Instead of, do you get along well with kids, it was more like, do you get along well with adults? And the theory was, in college, in higher ed, you're going to have a more generalized population and a special needs that I was talking about before. She modified 5 questions. He said it doesn't affect validity. She completed her study, the results of which she was, like I thought, people with higher levels of self-determination on that scale, in higher ed, went on to graduate higher rates. They went on to get better jobs, higher paying jobs. They went on to be happier in life. Okay. My research is distinguished from Jameson in that she looked at disabilities in general. I'm looking at one specific type of disability. Again, it's this invisible disability. The most common disability, yet paradoxically, there's very little to no research on. Okay? So, I designed my study. I put together a mixed methods design. Okay, what I just described is the quantitative portion of it. Okay, but there's also a qualitative piece. The qualitative piece stems from a study that Stage and Milne back in 1996 completed on students in higher ed with disabilities also. They were looking at self-determination. What they did, as I said, was purely qualitative. They did a series of interviews, they coded, they mapped all this kind of stuff, looking for levels of self-determination. And their research, again, showed that with their scoring and whatnot, the people with higher levels of self-determination tended to graduate at higher levels, get better paying jobs, were happier, etc. Okay? I got permission from all 3 of the authors to include their work, for my work, adapting, etc. With regard to Stage and Milne, there were 9 questions I ended up using. She said I could go ahead and adapt them. I kind of changed a couple because, as you'll hear in a minute or two, when it came to categorizing my data, I need to have certain characteristics in front of me, like, do you have an invisible disability? If yes, what is it? Because I don't want to be looking at the wrong population, obviously. Okay. But I also ask questions like, what's your age, how many semesters, what's your GPA, etc. Because, as you remember from the title, I'm looking at successful students. Okay, successful is defined in this study, 2.0 GPA or higher, coupled with completion of at least 1 semester in the school, from which I took the participants. Okay? That was the idea. Put those things together. Got my IRB approved. And for the next year, as Dr. Levitt will remember, In the course of a year, I had approximately 10 people at a local Midwestern university participate in this study. Okay? A little disappointed, but I'm good. Went back to Dr. Levin. We talked, we thought about getting a different site. Well, as luck would have it, I'm an adjunct instructor at a local community college. And I have a really cool boss. He's actually here today. His name is Dr. Michael Pepper. And I talked to Dr. Pepper and I told him, you know, I'm having some trouble getting participants for this study. Can you help? Can we maybe do it at our school? He said, let's go talk to the dean. We talked to the dean. I showed him the prospectus and all that from Lindenwood. The dean said, fill out these forms. They went back and forth a couple times, but eventually Lindenwood and this community college agreed to let me do the research there. Okay? How do we do the research? In terms of recruitment, I had to kind of step out of the picture. I'm an adjunct. Dr. Hettner is the chair of the criminal justice program. So I kind of step away because I can't actively recruit people when I'm a teacher, right? It's called ethics. I can't do it. I stepped out of the picture. Dr. Hettner took over, talked to his other adjuncts, and asked them, would you please mention Joe's study? Let's see if we can get some participation here. We can offer them extra credit, etc. What ended up happening was an online, on SurveyMonkey, an online verbatim administration of the Jameson modified arc. The 5 questions I told you about, ended up giving those verbatim, online, untimed, completely anonymous. On the back end of that was questions from stage and million. Again, most of them were, how old are you, GPA, invisible disability, what is it? The definition I used for the study of invisible disability appears so that the people could, you know, self-identify. The study lasted for 1 month. It was an online, again, like I said, the link was open for 1 month. At that point, I started talking with Dr. Wisdom. And we were talking about what I wanted to do, how I needed to do it, and what should happen next. And her opinion was to go ahead, now that by this point, Dr. Hettner reported to me that 377 students in 16 classes were informed about the study. Ultimately, there was a response rate of 32.1%. I believe that was 121 students decided to complete the survey. Again, I was talking with Dr. Wisdom. She thought that would be enough for what I needed to do for this study. I ended up looking at the various factors, and there were a few people who didn't quite meet the definition of being successful, so I pulled them out, but I was left with a random sample, a total, you know, that qualified as, you know, disabled or not, and then coupled with having a 2.0 GPA of 110 people. Okay, from there, I was advised to randomly select for statistical analysis, and I'll talk about that in a second. Randomly select 30 students who had no disability and 20 students who had an invisible disability. And what Dr. Wisdom really wanted me to do, she wanted me to run z-tests. Okay? She wanted me to run z-tests looking at differences in means between the two groups on some questions. You're probably thinking, what questions are you talking about, Joe? Well, if you look on your handout, you'll see my hypothesis. Okay? There's the top, there's my research question, sure. There's my hypothesis, you know, looking at different levels of self-determination. But you'll note in the sub-hypotheses, 1A, 1B, 1C, 1D, do you remember a few minutes ago when I was talking about these 4 essential characteristics from Waymeyer? Those are there, right there. Because what happens is when you take this test, this Waymeyer, a modified Waymeyer instrument, you get different scales. It's kind of like an IQ test, for those of you who are familiar with that. You have your verbal abilities here, you got your nonverbal over here, because on the instrument you have your memory and your speed. All these things you can measure against other people and come up with various scale scores, you know, relation to one another. You can do that here too. But also like an IQ test, you put all those things together, and you get a full scale IQ, or in this case, a total self-determination score, based on these different domain scores, as Waymeyer does. Okay? That was the idea. Okay, so I went ahead and I did z-tests, looking at differences in means between these two populations, okay, for each of these questions. All right, you ready to hear the results? Okay, this was kind of surprising me. We're going to talk to Dr. Levitt, and she said that given what they are, I can record them this way. On each and every hypothesis that I have listed in front of you, there was no statistical significant difference between the two populations after running the z-test. In other words, self-determination in my study existed at equal levels between the two groups. Okay? Yes, there were observable differences, but in terms of actual statistical operations, they were equivalent for each hypothesis, both populations. Okay. I told you that this was a mixed study, and it is. The questions, there were a few questions that I thought, looking after at Stage and Mills' earlier study, would be applicable to both groups, right? I looked at the following questions I'm listing them. What does self-determination mean to you and why? What do you do when you have difficulty learning? And how do you feel when you compare with other students your age? Okay, I thought both populations could talk about that. And what I did was, I reviewed the data live, and I was talking to Dr. Levitt. I was thinking of the Maxwell 2005 text and the Frankel Blue book that we all have in class, right? And I ended up looking at content analysis. And what I was going for, I was looking for themes. I looked for emerging themes from these people. Okay? Now, I didn't go through earlier how there are different people were free to pick and choose what they decide. When you do the informed consent, this is voluntary, you can stop anytime you want, etc. Well, a lot of people didn't opt to do that. Okay, some did, some didn't. So again, when I'm reporting out to you what I found in the qualitative portion, there's an asterisk. Not everyone chose to complete, that was their choice. Okay? But what I did find was that for reviewing data, emerging themes did result. And these emerging themes were actually on par with the 4 essential characteristics from Wainwright. There's autonomy in both populations, psychological empowerment, self-realization, and self-regulation. Again, couldn't measure, but I could know that they were there, or they appeared to be there. They were emerging. And what else I found interesting, in both groups, again, they were there, but for each question, there was the same essential characteristics. That's not to say that all questions had all 4 essential characteristics, but that is to say that if you looked at the disabled group, the characteristics they had that I used as emerging themes were identical to those of the non-disabled group. Okay? I thought that was kind of cool. So, implications of my study. Well, again, for my study, again, being the only one that I could really find anywhere, as after I did it showed that in this study, self-determination exists in both populations, successful students with invisible disabilities and successful students with no disabilities, statistically at the same level, okay, according to Wainwright's theory of self-determination. All right, it's kind of neat. But it also shows the idea we can do something going forward. Okay? Based on this study, and I hope subsequent research, people in the K-12 world can talk to people with the IEPs, with the special educational needs. They can go ahead and they can put in objectives for the IEP, suggesting ways to improve self-determination. Okay? In higher ed, when someone comes to school for the first time, we have these welcoming weeks, right? We have different programs where we can maybe incorporate self-determination activities amongst all students, irrespective of disability or not. You're here to introduce them to the population. Why not? My time's getting short. Let me talk about a couple things that I'd like to do going forward with this, okay? I would have preferred, if I were to refute what I just did, or to add to it, or if someone else were to do those things, I would have preferred more people, right? 30 and 20 is really hard to generalize to at a time country, okay? I also think aiming for more than one population site would be a great idea. Again, generalizability. There's very little research in this field anyway. We need to do more research. I think a month may have been short. The month started at the beginning of the semester, 16 weeks, 1 month, 8 longer. Okay. But most importantly, what I want to do differently going forward was I want to include more populations. Not the numbers, yeah, that's true. But I want to look at self-determination using the same instrument in populations that weren't successful, right? I looked at successful students. What about those who are not? I want to look at invisible disabilities, students with invisible, the research says they're dropping out. Okay, maybe we can somehow get